Oh. All right, quick question. This is an audience participation. We're all together, and we're trying to decide on a restaurant. How many in the crowd, as soon as somebody says a name, you'll say, no, I want to go to that one? Do we have some? Not more of you, I think, are involved in this. Or do you say something like, well, I don't want Mexican food tonight? So you start, okay, negative side. But how many of you are like, hey, let's go to, like, you've got like a suggestion, like it's a power play, like you're ready to go. Yeah, all right. Yeah, several of you. Okay, I appreciate that. The reason I bring this up is because I think positives and negatives can both be helpful. Like, if somebody says, I'm just not feeling Mexican food tonight, then you could say, okay, well, I won't suggest that. I'm going to go with, Italian or German or American cuisine or whatever. So it can be helpful. But sometimes the positive is also helpful. And I want to make sure that you understand that in the world that we live in the spiritual realm that we live in, there's a positive and negative aspect to this thing that we call the good news, right? We've been saved from something, but we've been saved to something. Does that make sense? We've received forgiveness for the things that we shouldn't have done, we shouldn't have said, or whatever. But now we're moving toward a life that is a life that's pleasing to God, a life that we would call Christian, or we would call godly, or whatever you want to call to it, or however you would want to describe it. And I really want to get into the things that we're called toward. 2 weeks ago, brothers Jesse and Dylan did the first installment of kind of two pieces inside of this larger series called and Set Apart. And then we had to, instead of doing it sequentially, we had to disrupt the rhythm a little bit because Gilbert and Janetta, they and their car got beat up pretty badly in an accident. And so we decided that Janetta might at least want a few days to kind of heal up. She did a phenomenal job last week talking about adoption. If you didn't hear it, you probably should. Just some really powerful truths contained in that message. But I want to talk about what we're set apart, because when we talk about being set apart, when we talk about being called, I think it's for something, but it's also for someone. So when we talk about being set apart, other words that sometimes get used in the Bible, sometimes get used in conversation, are being sanctified. We're being sanctified. Paul talks about this at the end of Thessalonians, how he's praying that they would be sanctified through and through. Like, this isn't just something that we want a little bit of. We want a lot of it. And many of us understand that process of growth and development, where God is working on us and God is working in us, and something that maybe we weren't even thinking about, He begins to bring to our attention, and it's an area maybe that we give up, or it's a step of faith that we lean into. That's what we mean about this concept or this understanding of sanctification. We also talk about something being consecrated. Certain things are consecrated for specific use, reserved for God's purposes. You probably have some things like this in your house, right? There are certain things that, for instance, you use for eating. If you have a plumbing job, you don't go grab the cereal bowls. You with me? You shouldn't. I'm not saying you didn't. I'm just saying you shouldn't. They should be consecrated for cereal, or better yet, ice cream. We see this in the Old Testament, because when the temple is being developed, there are a lot of worship utensils inside their basins and tongs and a variety of things that anybody would have, but these were set apart. They were only for worship. They were only for this time of coming before God and having encounters with Him. The New Testament uses similar language, interestingly enough. When Paul wrote to Timothy for the second time, he said, if you keep yourself pure, you will be a special utensil for honorable use. Your life will be clean, and you will be ready for the master to use you for every good work. And so he paints this picture of the work that God is doing in us. And honestly, I think a lot of this comes down to identity, where we understand who we are. And because we understand who we are, there's a cooperative spirit in terms of what God wants to do in us. 1 Peter chapter 2:9, you are a chosen people. You are royal priests. You are a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you can show others the goodness of God, for He called you out of the darkness into His wonderful light. You are made holy by Jesus Christ. And that's a part of this whole understanding of being called and set apart. In fact, the word holy literally means set apart. That's one of the definitions. How many of you do a great job of becoming holy by willpower? I'm just going to gut it out this week. I'm going to have a cape on the back. It's going to have the letter H on it that stands for holy. No, most of us have discovered that that's not really the way that works. We are made holy through Christ's sacrifice and indwelling Spirit. Hebrews 10:10 says, for God's will was for us to be made holy by the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once and for all. Now, sometimes people take this and they run weird directions with it. And so it's like, well, in order to be holy, I need to stay away from things that are unholy. That logic it has a little bit of merit to it, right? But there's only so much of that one can do, right? I mean, you could get a cabin out in the mountains somewhere in Colorado and stay away from all that is unholy. That's an option, but we're really not called for that, right? When we talk about being set apart and called, we're talking about being called toward God's purpose for our life. And it's much less about being physically separated from the world, and it's much more about living differently in it. Paul says in Romans 12 that if we give our bodies to God because of all He's done, and we let them be living in holy sacrifices, the kind He finds acceptable, this is a true way to worship Him. And then he says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. And what happens is when we understand what we're called to and to whom we're called, our character and our values begin to reshape around the heart and character of God. Do not lower that down to simple, better behavior. Because Christianity is a lot of things, but it's not a simple behavior modification model. I would also suggest to you, because some of you have been in church for a while, being set apart, being called, doesn't mean being weird. Do I need to elaborate, or have you seen enough weird? You're good? Okay. It does not mean acting holier than thou. Because sometimes people put on a lot of facade in front, but inside there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of struggle, a lot of pain, a lot of issues and things happening. And typically, weird and holier than thou people, I try not to, I think most of us just avoid that. Or at least we limit exposure there, because when there's a true distinction in the way somebody loves other people, when there's a true humility that somebody exhibits, when there is a pursuit of those things that are godly, when there's an integrity and a generosity, not only do you and I want to be that, we want to be around people who are that. Because there's something attractive in that. And I love being around people that there's just something about their spirit that just seems genuine. And it's real. And it's authentic. And when we talk about being called and set apart, those are some of the things that we're talking about. In fact, Jesus even prayed for his disciples in John 17 that they would be in the world. They just wouldn't be like it. It's like, guys, you need to stand out a little bit. But it's not just about what God's doing in me. It's understanding that I'm also set apart for mission. Not missions necessarily going to another country, although some of you have and some of you might in the future. It's understanding that my life is on mission. It's not just personal holiness. It's about being sent out. Didn't Jesus talk about us being lights and salt that would give flavor? That's enough of that. Let's talk about the cost of it. Luke chapter 14, Jesus is saying some things that are pretty challenging. And he says in verse 27, if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you can't be a disciple. Oh. And then he says, but don't begin until you count the cost, right? Have you ever started something and you didn't count the cost? Has anybody ever bought a money pit or a car that, the person said it was in pretty good shape and then you found out it wasn't? He's just count the cost. It's just some. And so we really got into, not a debate in our teaching team, but we got into a lot of facets of what this means. I don't think taking up your cross means that somebody didn't wish you Merry Christmas. It's like, I don't think that, taking up your cross means, it's like you have an occasional bad day or, somebody called you a name or something like that. I really think there's a depth to this conversation that Jesus is having with his disciples. Let me just give you some thoughts on this. So sometimes I think the cost of saying yes to Christ is saying no to something else. In fact, I think it's often that way. And here's what I think about most Christians. I don't think most of you were planning bank robberies this week. I don't think most of you were saying, let's go over and beat up the neighbor. I mean, maybe a couple of you were doing stuff like this, but, by and large, we don't really, but what I do think is, I think believers can get into cycles of doing so much good that they're not zoned into God's best. Like they're living out their calling and three other people's. It's like they're just so busy, and here's something Jesus says in John chapter 15 that I find fascinating. He says he prunes the branches that bear fruit so they'll produce even more. So I love to landscape. Some of you know that. I've told you that before. I've got some gorgeous knockout roses. It's a beautiful color of pink, very close to the shirt that Pierre has on. Pierre, can you show them that shirt? Because that's just handsome and dashing. And so here's the thing with knockout roses and a lot of other plants, once the bloom is spent, you need to get rid of it so a new bloom will come in and take its place. And I think sometimes I need that same process in my life. I've got some stuff that's dead over here that he needs to cut away so that more can grow and more can come from what God has asked me to do and what he's asked me to be a part of. Some people, some of you, and I know names, I mean, I could call some of you out. Some of you say yes because you're so stinking guilt motivated. And you feel like if you say no, that you're letting everybody down and, the world's going to end and all these kinds of things. And I'm like, probably not. Probably not. No, hold with me. Just keep thinking with me. Not every opportunity that you have in front of you is from God. Sometimes they're just opportunities. Sometimes they're just things. Okay. Hold that thought. I also think part of the cost means saying yes to God's agenda instead of just my own. Now, we live in a world that's got a lot of, conversation around self-care and all these kinds of things. Do I think that's important? Yes, I do. Some of us really need to lean into that. Absolutely. But if everything's about you, then you're missing the boat. You with me? I mean, it's just not. And sometimes the busyness that people operate, how are you doing? I'm busy. Nobody ever said that to you? Busy. It's like, when are you not busy? It's like when you're sleeping. Well, sometimes my dreams keep me pretty busy too. Rebecca, sometimes we'll get up in the morning and she'll be like, whew, I am wore out, man. Those dreams, I was like running and we were doing stuff and building houses and, tearing apart cars. And I'm like, dude, I'm so glad I wasn't with you in that. It's like, that just sounds tiring even listening. It's like, I think sometimes the busyness that people operate in sometimes is not what God has asked them to do, nor is it as impactful or as important as other things that God has asked you to do. And I will tell you this, sometimes the thing that God asks you to do from a human perspective do not look important in that moment. He will ask you to talk to somebody in a grocery store, as an example. And you're thinking, this is dumb, and I don't know that person, et cetera, et cetera. And next thing you know, you're in this conversation, or, you had maybe an opportunity to pray with somebody. Some of you are in healthcare. I know I've talked with, nurses and physicians, and they're like, we just prayed with this patient today. It was just exactly the right thing to do in that moment, or maybe they asked for that. Is the medical procedure important? You betcha. You betcha. Is asking God to help? Yes, absolutely it is. Busy is not hard to do. It is not hard to do. Filling up a calendar, easy peasy. Making a difference takes intentionality. Here's something. Let's hold that thought. I think sometimes we say no out of fear, fatigue, or feelings of inadequacy or insecurity. Let me say that one more time. Sometimes we say no out of fear, fatigue, feelings of inadequacy, or insecurity. Maybe here's the bottom line. Maybe we need to dig into the why behind our wanting to say yes or no and just make sure we're tuned in. Like, do you want me to say yes to this? Because if you do, I'll do it even though I'm fearful or I don't feel like I'm adequate. I can't tell you how many times as a public speaker that I stand up in front of people and think, this message, there's nothing here. I don't know why people even show up. Now, these are just voices in your head, right? Some of you feel the same way when you go to work. How many parents have felt like, we have no idea what we're doing? It's like, here's another cost. We've talked about that enough. Living with an awareness of others watching you as a Christian. And I want to be very, very careful here because I cannot always live the expectations of other people. I'm not talking about that. Okay? The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 9, he said, even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I too lived under the law, even though I'm not subject to it. Now, this is an individual who was raised in the Jewish law, was a Pharisee, which means he was a strong adherent to the law, like strong adherent to the law. And he says, I did this so I could bring those under the law to Christ, right? And he talks about, sometimes you're with people that are weak. And he's not talking about people that can't bench press. He's saying sometimes you're with somebody who spiritually just doesn't have a lot of maturity and experience under their belt. And he was just like, I'm just careful when I'm around that person so that I don't discourage them in their faith. Does that make sense? We were talking about this in teaching team, and Janetta said, have you read after Leonard Sweet when he unpacks and talks out 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. Some of you recognize 1 Corinthians 13 as being the love chapter. Fantastic material. I think, and we just went ahead and copied it and put it on your seats or around you. And he says, some words are so rich, so layered, so complex yet simple that the only way to define them is by saying what they are not. Paul did this when he wrote 1 Corinthians 13. And I love the not impatient line. Did you see this? Love doesn't tap its foot. You ever been around somebody? You're talking, they're tapping, or you're talking and they're scrolling? I was with one of my brothers Friday, and we were talking about when our wives talk. And both of us were talking about trying to be in a pattern when our wives talk that we do this. Because she deserves to be heard. So do your friends. So does your family. How about unkindness? Love doesn't dress cruelty up as honesty. It doesn't say, I'm just telling it like it is, when really it's tearing someone else down. It doesn't mock mistakes, weaponize humor, or laugh at someone else's expense. It refuses the cheap shots, the icy silences, the passive-aggressive digs. Love never confuses bluntness with brutality or candor with contempt. Wow. See, we're called to something. We're called to live differently in a world. We're called to not just be one more voice on the post that agrees with all the vitriol and all the anger and all the frustration. And on it goes. I'll let you read the rest of it. But I just think it's so important to understand what we've been called to. And this isn't pressure on you. This is living into the work that God is doing in you and that God will do through you because of the work that he already did on the cross. So how to live set apart? 3 easy steps, right? No, but I think important ones. One is that new mindset. So Romans 12, a few years ago I was listening to Caroline Leaf. She was doing a lot of research on brains, and she did a 21-day kind of a rewiring of your brain, and she was talking about how we create all these cool neural pathways, and it enables us to drive home without really thinking about it. There's just a lot of things our brains does. And she said it's because they're lazy, and I'm thinking, no, I don't think it's because they're lazy. I'm thinking God designed them to be pretty efficient, actually. If I have to think about breathing and my heart beating all the time, it's going to be hard to carry on a conversation. I'm just really glad those things are there and taken care of. But she talked about sometimes, though, we can have patterns that are not good or not healthy, and we can change those, but it takes effort. And so the 21 days is building a new neural pathway. And so you might be thinking, I'm dumb. I've always been dumb. I was told I was dumb. And that pathway is well developed. And not only is that pathway well developed, there are even tributaries leading from that one to other ones. And she said, the only way that we can do that is that we have to speak truth, and we have to consistently come back at the truth. And it takes 21 days for that old pathway to start diminishing and the new one to form. But then it takes about another 21 days for that thing to become strong enough so there's actually some heft to it. And then it probably takes about another 21 days for that to become a little bit more of your go-to thought. And it probably takes a lifetime to continue making sure that that's not the go-to. And I heard that, and I was thinking of Romans chapter 12 when she was speaking, and it says, don't copy the customs of behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by what? Changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. It's difficult to act inconsistent with the way that you think. I have a friend that I love and I love dearly. He's stuck. He's just plain stuck. Every conversation is the same conversation, and the problem has persisted. And despite words of wisdom, encouragement, and sometimes just down and out challenges, he's stuck. Did you ever get stuck? I liken it to the person who's in Kansas City and would love to go to St. Louis. but they can't get off 435. You're stuck. You're going somewhere. It's just the same. When Paul talks to the church at Rome, he says, you don't have to stay stuck. You can be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And it's in that renewal process where the Word becomes alive in us and the Holy Spirit is able to push it down deep into our souls and it becomes our go-to. I used to think God was always angry at me, and if He wasn't angry, He was disappointed. And what I discovered is God actually loves me and likes me amazingly more than I could even imagine. And I don't think I will ever get over the wonder of that or the excitement of that. Some of us need to get unstuck. How? How do we have a new mindset? And I think that comes through a regular time with God, but I don't want to just like throw it out there and be like, you just need to pray and read your Bible more. And it's like, well, you might. You might, but maybe it's listening to the Word. That's what I decided to do this year on my YouVersion app. I haven't been reading it near as much as I've been listening to it because faith comes by hearing and hearing by the Word of God, Paul said to the church at Rome. And so I'm trying that to see if that's helping. And sometimes I've journaled and sometimes I've had prayer walks and I sometimes fast, but very rarely because I hate fasting because I get in bad moods and my head aches. And I sometimes I just need to practice being aware of His presence because He's always everywhere, is He not? And sometimes I need meditation and sometimes I need stewardship, and sometimes I need celebration, and sometimes I need lament. I need to have regular time with God. It just doesn't always look the same all the time, every day. And you need to give yourself permission to have time alone with God, time in God's presence. And it's okay if it looks different on Monday and then Tuesday and then Wednesday. But I will say this. People cannot miss church, skip time in the Bible, never find time to pray, spectate instead of serve, hoard their finances, and expect to really grow spiritually or hear from God because you're cutting off a lot of the sources. You know, it's like, you know, one thing I've discovered after 46 years of marriage, we should talk often. We should spend time together. Why would that relationship not be a really good indicator of what my relationship with God needs to look like? And our relationship isn't the same every day. Some days we're busy and it's finally at the end of the day, we both hit the bed. You know, like when you just fall into bed those nights, you know what I'm talking about? You hit the bed and it's like, oh, we haven't talked all day. And we talk. And then other days we have time and we can do things differently. If any of you wants to be my follower, you need to give up your own way and take up your cross and follow me. What Jesus say? I'm the vine, you're the branches. Abide, connect, remain, get close. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Build a few key relationships. A spiritual family who keep you on course, encourage, understand grace, focus living. We've already talked about that. How about God-honoring management of time, talents, and treasures? Here's something that we talked about. If your bank statement and calendar went viral, what would it say about your faith? And maybe that's too short of a list. Maybe we should throw some other things in there. But I just managing things in a way that honors God. And then there's the results of living set apart. And that is simply God is able to work through you because He's working in you. And what Timothy said at the very beginning of this message? If you keep yourself pure, you'll be a special utensil. Why am I having such a difficult time with that dumb word? Utensil. There. For honorable use, your life will be clean and you'll be ready for the Master to use you for every good work. And here's the result of this. You become a living demonstration of faith. Like people see it in you, right? You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. That's you. Why? Because I've been set apart for something and someone. My life can make a difference. Like I get to go out and show people Jesus. All right, that's all I got. You done? Let's stand. 1 Peter 2:9. You are God's chosen people. You're what? A royal what? Priesthood? A holy what? Man, our nation needs to hear that line. God's special possession, that you may declare the praise of him who called you out of darkness into wonderful light. That's you. Go live like that. We'll see you next week.